Hi, and welcome to Pandora Workshop. Today we're going to show you how we made these really simple but lovely pink cherry blossom inspired dice. This method is great if, like us, you're just starting out with resin dice, since it's pretty foolproof, even though a couple of mistakes were made, but more on that later. First, you're going to mix your resin following the instructions of whatever brand you're opting for. In our case, since the resin we're using is very liquid, we went ahead and mixed it first to give it a little time to start thickening up. This helps achieve cooler effects when you're trying to get swirls. Just make sure you keep an eye on the clock so you don't go over the pot life, and remember the weather can affect that pot life, making it longer or shorter depending on the temperature of the room you're working in. Then we mix the tiniest amount of this cherry mica powder, which really has an iridescent effect. We made sure to use a very small amount since we want the resin to remain mostly clear and not opaque. Then we added pink metallic flakes straight into the mix. This is also where we find letting the resin thicken helps, since it keeps the flakes from just sinking to the bottom. Then we start filling up our mold. We usually add some resin to the cap before we start, just to prevent using up all the resin on the actual mold, and make sure the cap numbers are properly covered as well. For this set, since we're going for a very simple effect, we just went ahead and filled the mold up almost completely. So let's move on to the swirls. Using white alcohol ink, we poured a little outside onto our tray, and using a toothpick, we picked up a few drops and started swirling them into our mold. This method gives you much more control over how much ink you're using, and works great when you just want a hint of color and not a bold streak or swirl. Lastly, we went for a little failed experiment. We got these cherry blossom inserts and wanted to try them out, so we put a few into the D20. However, this was a mistake since they all ended up sinking and sticking together. It was still cool though, but it definitely wasn't what we were going for. But, you know, you live and you learn, especially when it comes to resin. After that, we poured whatever resin was left onto the mold and went over the bubbles with a small blowtorch. Yes, we used a blowtorch because we're extra and we had one, but a lighter or a heat gun worked just as well. We then put the cap on following our keys to make sure it's in the correct position, and put slight pressure on it to get the extra resin out and make sure it's sitting perfectly flat. We dropped it in the pressure pot, which is something you don't really need if you're just starting out, but we'll talk about that in a future video. If you don't have a pressure pot, you can just leave them out to cure. Now it's time to see how this set turned out. We got rid of the excess resin or flashing and carefully demolded our dice, gently pulling them out to protect the mold from tearing. And as you can see, these look really nice. The flakes are all visible, it has that iridescent sheen from the mica powder, you can see the white swirls have done really interesting things. The flowers on the D20, like we mentioned, just kind of sank to the bottom, but that's okay. We think they look great anyway, and since they're facing the 20, you get a nice flowery critical hit. After cleaning up the edges a little with an X-Acto knife to remove any excess resin, you can polish them if you like. We didn't really see the need to polish these since they came out quite shiny and they're just going to be used at home for fun. But if you want to achieve that cool glass-like effect, you'd need to polish them down with some very fine grit papers. We then moved on to inking. Now we were short of any pinks that fit these dies, so we decided to get creative and we used Vallejo Matte Medium mixed with a little bit of this mauve mica powder. I wouldn't recommend doing this since it was an absolute pain. It started getting really clumpy, and it wasn't really that pigmented, so we had to give it quite a few coats. Spare yourself the pain and just go with a proper paint. Regardless, the color we got gave the set exactly the look we were going for. And there you have it, a pretty easy to make cherry blossom-esque set. We find that sets like these always bring out compliments when we use them in our games, since they're a little bit different from most of the sets we have. Let us know what you think in the comments, and please be kind with our mistakes. We are beginners after all. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.